Wonderful. Thank you all for bearing with us there. Our second panel today is zeroing in on the life sciences space and what is needed to ensure the UK's position as a world leader within this industry. What partnerships are required, how can the sector, NHS and academia drive collaboration, and how can a post-EU framework build on the success that's already been achieved with the COVID vaccine to fast-track further innovations. And to tackle those many topics, I am joined by John Baker, Senior Vice President for Product Portfolio and Innovation at Abcam, Nicole Jadeja, Life Sciences Partner at Pinsent Masons, Dr. Emma Stanton, Vice President for Clinical at Oxford Nanopore, and Adam Stoughton, Senior Vice President for Academic Partnerships at Evotec. Thanks all for being here. Emma, to turn to you first, if that's okay. What, in your view, are the most important elements that are driving innovation in life sciences at the moment? And what kind of partnerships does the industry require to make the UK a world leader here? Easy question to begin with.
Thanks. I mean, this is such an important part of the DNA of what makes up Oxford's nanopore technologies. We were essentially a spin-out from Oxford University 15 years ago, had a successful IPO on the London Stock Exchange last year. But what's really driven Oxford Nanopore and what's made the UK a successful ecosystem for it is the combination of the innovation and the ambition that the company has had. So even from when Oxford Nanopore Technologies first began, the thinking was always to build a global company. The thinking was always to build a platform company. And we only focused on the products later on in our development. But a huge amount of money and time has gone into the research and development that has made up the unique nanopore platform that has created the sort of product that some, but I'm guessing not all, may be familiar with. So this is a MinION device. It's one of several devices that we have that allows DNA and RNA sequencing in real time. It's used mainly by researchers in universities, academic environments around the world. But I think what's driven Oxford Nanopore is to think like a big company. Even when we were really small, that's always been the ethos. And last week was London Tech Week. That showed what an exciting ecosystem we have here in the UK, but we've really benefited from many of the research collaborations that we have both here in the UK and globally. And as we've matured on the research and development of the platform, we've then focused on innovating in the manufacturing base. Our manufacturing factory is in the Harwell cluster, just outside Oxford. So that's led to further development of jobs and skills in the UK as well. But underpinning all of this is the ambition, and we're now commercialising on that as part of the next chapter in the nanopore journey.
Brilliant, thank you. Nicole, from your seat at Pinsent Masons, how are you seeing the life sciences sector evolve in the UK at the moment, and what are you looking at with most interest in the years ahead? I wonder if there are new regulatory frameworks, for example, that might speed up the pace of development innovation.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think probably what we are seeing and what we will see increasingly more of, and I know it's a theme which has already come out this morning, but clearly the importance of collaboration. We're going to see unprecedented levels of collaboration, but those collaboration models are changing. We're seeing different stakeholders partaking in the collaborations. People are thinking about their competitors in a very different way than they did previously. That's in part because we've seen some of the legal relaxation around some of the competition laws we saw coming out of COVID. And whilst we think those competition laws are going to, they're not going to stay as relaxed as they were during COVID, they're still going to be there. There is going to be, I think people's mindset is changing in terms of how they look at their competitors. So I think we're going to see much more collaboration. And the nature of that collaboration is changing. The players are changing. So there's going to be much more collaboration between life sciences and tech. And Emma's company is a perfect example of that. So we're going to see much more tech players driving how we collaborate and innovate. We're going to see the increasing role of universities. I mean, that's what we've really seen over the last 12, 18 months, the huge number of collaborations with universities and the universities wanting to play a really key role in the nature of the collaboration. So we're going to see different players, tech, university. Data and digitalisation is going to be absolutely critical, and it's going to be a game changer to how we collaborate and innovate going forwards. And all of those things are driving the collaboration models. You know, we're no longer seeing collaborations with a single party and a single asset. It's much more complex, where there's many more parties coming into the collaborations. Collaborations are starting earlier, which is absolutely critical. They're involving patients, which is also absolutely critical because, of course, we're developing medicines in a world where it's becoming more personalised, and we are going to have to demonstrate the value that those medicines bring, so involving patients at the outset so that you get that framework. So the big thing for us that we are seeing already, and which we will undoubtedly see more of, is collaboration, and in a very different way and in a very different models. And sort of as lawyers, our role is to make sure everyone's value is, there's value given to everybody's contribution, and that was talked about earlier today, and that's going to be absolutely critical to the success of those collaborations. And I think, interestingly, what we're seeing is the legal framework is going to give us that space and flexibility to do that. You talked in particular about the regulatory framework, and as we all know, there was some, not relaxation, but the MHRA demonstrated a real dynamism and flexible approach in the development of the COVID vaccines, which was absolutely critical. And whilst that can't continue to the same extent, there are undoubtedly very innovative ways we can look at the regulatory framework, and the regulators are showing a real willingness to do that. So they're going to give us that scope and ability, I think, to get drugs to patients quicker. And the collaborations are obviously going to be what facilitates that and drives that forwards.
Adam, when we were speaking ahead of the panel today about the big challenges, you touched on something that we've already spoken about in the first panel, and I have a sneaking suspicion it will be raised numerous times over the course of the day, but that access to talent. Again, it seems to keep coming back to challenges around that. How stark is the challenge from your perspective, and what's amplified the issues that are being faced there?
Yeah, and it was no surprise to hear it mentioned in the first panel at all, and I think it will be a recurring theme. It's absolutely an issue, a challenge in life sciences. So by way of context, Evotec is one of the world's largest preclinical drug discovery and development companies. So we are a partnerships company. We work with everybody from the world's largest pharmaceutical companies down to small spin-outs from universities to help them develop their new medicines through to the point at which they can start clinical trials. We're also an equity investor in biotechs and a co-development partner. We, from our partial roots, at least in an Oxford spin-out about 20 years ago, have grown to about 4,200 people worldwide, nearly 1,000 of which are now in the UK. So a great example of how those early university innovations can grow to generate significant jobs and wealth creation. And we've grown in the UK ecosystem because it's been a great life sciences ecosystem. I mean, we're kind of a barometer for how it's developed over the last 10, 15 years or so. We've grown because there's opportunity here. We've grown because there's talent here. And we want to continue growing here. We're nearly 750 people on Milton Park in Abingdon. We're just invested in a new UK headquarters building. The growth ambitions are very significant. But the UK is the single hardest jurisdiction for us to recruit in at the moment. We have sites in Germany, France, Italy, the US, both East and West Coast. And the UK is really, really tough. And I think we're seeing it get even tougher because of convergence, because of the increased demand within the life sciences sector for skills that might be more normally thought of as tech, so AI, ML, et cetera. So, we're not going to be a scientific superpower if we run out of substrate to fuel that enzymatic reaction. If we're looking for catalysts, you need a substrate, right? And talent is the most important substrate. IP is great, world-beating innovations, inventions coming out of universities. I don't think we're going to run dry of those. Talent, I have real concerns about. And it's, of course, not something that we can address like a switch. It's not there's no magic bullet for it. So I think we're going to have to see increased investment into mechanisms that help drive that talent. And obviously, universities have a huge role to play in that in terms of educating graduates. But also, this needs to reach right back into schools, inspiring children to pursue careers in these areas, which we know are going to be critically important for continued economic development in the UK. And if we ignore that, we will cut ourselves off at the knees. And it's challenging now. It will be much worse in 10 years' time if we don't invest in this.
What other mechanisms are there that we can call on? And that's for any of our panelists to pick up.
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think, again, it's been talked about today, but it's starting at the root cause, so in schools and right at that stage, and encouraging STEM subjects. Certainly my daughter's 10, but I'd be encouraging her to go down sort of the data, AI, we have a real shortage of data analysts, and I think we all recognise that data and digitalisation is going to really drive this sector forwards. And then I guess we need incentives, don't we? We need incentives for talent here to be able to retain talent and recruit the best talent. And it's a shame because we've got so much talent on our doorsteps within the ARC, for example, as a prime example. But we need to just make sure there are career paths and ways to incentivise people to stay in the sector and keep the skills within the UK power base.
And I think part of one of the questions for talent is infrastructure. Relevant to this room, how do they find somewhere to live which is accessible to where we'd very much like them to work? We've all asked ourselves this morning, how hard was it to get into London? Was it all right? It shouldn't be that difficult. But for a lot of, particularly the emerging scientists, just getting from central Cambridge to where we and our friends are at AstraZeneca, very close to the centre of Cambridge, is really difficult. Finding somewhere to live that's remotely commutable to Cambridge is difficult. So I think however good the talent we educate in the UK or enable to get to the UK, helping them get to work and be productive when they get there is really tricky.
I completely agree. And, we're not going to solve the talent issue purely by homegrown. We need to bring people into the country with the relevant skills. And, I think for them to want to remain in an ecosystem, you need to have that connectivity and that optionality. And I mean, that's the beauty of the Oxford-Cambridge ARC, the Golden Triangle as a whole. And there is that critical mass there. People can move into that ecosystem and they can join a high-risk company, which might go belly up in 2 or 3 years, but they know there are probably half a dozen other companies doing something close enough that they can get a job there. And that's a facet of all the world's best ecosystems. You've got that ability to just move between companies. But without that connectivity, that doesn't happen.
No, you're right. So I think we need more things like the Genome Campus, which is being developed in Cambridge. We were working on together with the Wellcome Trust, but real investment, like you say, in the infrastructure, so that there's the housing and there's the communities and sort of the real draw to get people to these areas.
To shift topics slightly, I wanted us to talk about funding. We had a submitted question from William Spriggins at Biomed Connections, who said, one of the issues for life science startups is how in time to scale up their operations. France has raised a €5 billion scale-up fund for tech startups. How can we compete? Any thoughts on that access to funding question?
I'm happy to take a start. There's multiple different steps on that funding journey, and I think one of the comments from the previous panel was, how do we move faster from startup to unicorn plus IPO? I think our perspective, we work with life scientists in proteomics around the world. Actually, only about 5% of our business at Abcam is in the UK. Significantly more is in the other life science clusters. As we're working with early stage companies and customers, our focus is mostly early and translational. The sort of seed startup, early venture rounds seem pretty well resourced in the UK. We're starting to see a few more macro Series B, Series C, Series D. I think we've got Mark Cotter on a panel from BitBio, who've had one of the UK's largest kind of mid rounds. But there's a real struggle, I think, in moving through those rounds at pace and then getting to scale with public investment, and not just the investors, but the analysts to cover it. So even as a mid-cap, UK founded, we recently listed on NASDAQ in the US to get access to a more dedicated pool of life science investors and analysts who had a better understanding of the space. And if we felt the need to do that as a fairly established mid-cap, I think for companies that are trying to move briskly through the funding cycles in the UK, actually that dearth of analyst community and understanding in depth of life science is a real challenge.
What else has that dual listing revealed to you about the differences in attitudes within the capital markets in both jurisdictions? I mean, you talk about the entire ecosystem there being more developed in the US in terms of not just the investors, but the analysts covering those stocks too. How notable is that difference between what you see in the UK and what you see in the US as a dual-listed company?
I think it's very striking that there's just more of a mindset around rapid growth, a greater appetite for understanding a value story of a company in life sciences beyond, the last 6 months, numbers and some multiples off the back of it. Now that's doing a disservice to some very talented analysts in the UK, but there's just a critical mass of folks with a deep industry understanding in the US and a liquidity of investors who are prepared to invest behind those sorts of high-quality growth stories.
Yeah. And Nanopore completed its IPO last year. I mean, how important do you see the UK public markets to the growth of life sciences? And are you convinced that the city with a capital C gets the opportunity that's there?
So first of all, on the IPO, we're a global company, but we're UK-based. That's where our headquarters and manufacturing capability is. And I think it was very much the ambition of the company to do the IPO on the London Stock Exchange to prove it was possible to have a successful IPO, to grow, build, and scale a successful life sciences business in the UK rather than go to the US, despite the many attractions as you describe. So I think that was a clear commitment from us as a UK-based company to do that in London. With regards to access to capital in the city, I think that has at times been challenging, and particularly for companies like Nanopore and others that have a long research and development cycle, where this is not going to necessarily show returns quickly. We are still loss-making. The investment is in the future potential. And certainly the aspect that I'm interested in the technology that we're building at Nanopore is, what does it mean for healthcare? We are only at the foothills of that, despite having the IPO, despite being a spin-out since 2005. And so the question is, how do you attract capital and investors that will be interested in the long-term returns? And we've been fortunate to work with some in that category.
Given the global nature of the business there, I was interested in your thoughts on working with the NHS to the extent that you do in the UK, and maybe how you would compare that to some of your international dealings with other parties. How do we capitalise on the role that the NHS can play in furthering life sciences in the UK?
So there is no doubt globally that the National Health Service that we have here offering care free at the point of access for everybody that needs that is envied the world over, especially in the US, where they haven't got that kind of infrastructure apart from for certain isolated populations. So from an Oxford Nanopore perspective, we have dozens of collaborations with universities, many of which spill over into sort of clinical academic labs, some but not all of which are co-located in hospital settings. Now, it's fair to say that from a revenue perspective, this represents a tiny proportion of what we're doing, but from a future potential perspective, the NHS is a key partner. Within the NHS, it's a complex sort of behemoth of a beast, and I say that as somebody who's practiced in the NHS for many years. There are certain arm's length bodies, and from a genomics perspective, we are fortunate to have Genomics England, established around 9 years ago, with the dual goals of accelerating research and transforming healthcare. And that sort of sums up where we are with Oxford Nanopore. So we work closely with Genomics England. They are an arm's length body of the Department of Health and Social Care, so the Secretary of State is their sole shareholder. And the Genomics England have 3 distinct programs. that we are working with them on. One is around Cancer 2.0, how we can use sequencing to better identify and inform treatment for people with cancer. Secondly is around newborn screening, how you can particularly identify rare genetic disorders at birth at an earlier stage and then help families make the right treatment decisions. And then thirdly, around data diversity, making sure that our genomics research really represents the diversity of the population that it's serving. So the NHS is a key partner for us. Underpinning that is our partnership with Genomics England. In addition, we have and are sponsoring some research at Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation Trust. That's one of a few hospitals that we're working closely with. You can see it just over the river from here. And they are using nanopore sequencing for patients in ITU who have ventilator-acquired pneumonia to identify the pathogens and make treatment decisions about giving antibiotics that those bugs are going to respond to. And in about a third of the cases that we are using nanopore sequencing on people with ventilator or hospital-acquired pneumonia, they are changing the antibiotic that the physician had initially prescribed. Now, the advantage of this sort of sensing technology that we're bringing here is that it gives results in hours, not days. When patients are in an intensive care setting, when they're critically unwell, that can make the difference between life and death. So the NHS as our partner is giving us the opportunity to have these kind of use cases, working closely with clinical researchers. Obviously, the clinicians who are responsible for the patient care are ultimately making those decisions, but it's giving us the opportunity to show how the tech platforms can be embedded in care pathways, and that's of significance to multiple healthcare systems throughout the world that we're now looking to replicate that with.
Excellent. Adam or John, anything to add to that in terms of relationships and dealings with?
I mean, the NHS is certainly important, as are universities to us, in terms of not only some of the initiatives that I'm involved in supporting the catalysis of early therapeutic programs to something more commercially focused, but actually in supporting a wider business. So, for example, we have a partnership with University of Bristol that we struck a few months ago, where we're accessing biological samples from patients with nephrotic syndrome, coupled with patient records from the NHS, and that provides an incredibly useful body of data from which we can identify both potential biomarkers but also molecular targets for new drugs. And you could replicate that so many times across the country in terms of biological sample plus patient data, and that's what gives us the potential for so much innovation in the UK. I mean, the challenge, as Emma's alluded, is that the NHS is so complex, and although it is a single entity, actually it's not. It's a gazillion trusts and individual points of entry or points of negotiation for accessing these things. And I think there have been some valiant efforts to try and really improve how companies can collaborate with the NHS, so through the academic health science networks, for instance, and I think they've done some fantastic work. I've had some direct experience working with the Oxford entity, but I don't think it's cracked the nut necessarily. I don't think it's, the floodgates haven't opened in terms of us really leveraging the enormity of the power and potential of the NHS to drive innovation in life sciences in this country. And everyone knows it's there. We still haven't quite found the solution.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. There are enormous assets in the NHS. Some of those get channeled, whether it's through Genomics England or the UK Biobank, which is sort of proteomics equivalent. But we often find our relationships with the NHS are at one step removed through an institution that is co-located in an NHS hospital. So the Cambridge Cancer Hospital that's spooling up or whatever else it might be, rather than in an integrated fashion that gives more direct access to the data and the patient experiences that the NHS has. Whereas all those smaller pockets, if we look at relationships we have with folks like MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas, or with A-Star in Singapore, which is a fully vertically integrated clinical through research institution, it is that much easier to find your port of entry, and there is somewhat more of a streamlined approach to getting collaboration set up at scale. So colossal asset with more to do to open up.
Yeah. Nicole, On the real estate side here, what kind of workspace demand changes are we seeing from the life science industry?
That's a good question, and I think what we're seeing is, or what we need to see is not that we just want to become an R&D power base, but we want to become a manufacturing power base, and that necessarily has a knock-on effect in terms of what real estate we're going to need. And the needs are quite diverse. So we've already just talked about the Genome Campus being developed in Cambridge, and I think we're going to need innovative space for the very different types of emerging technologies that we've got coming through with cell and gene therapies, for example. But also, I think it goes to your point about recruitment and connectivity, and having real estate space where that can, to facilitate that connectivity, to get A, the innovation, but B, retaining and attracting the talent that we're going to need to drive the sector forwards.
We had several submitted questions about the property needs of life sciences companies as they grow. Jeff McKenzie at Bridal Partners asked, how can landlords more effectively help to facilitate the growth of occupiers, given that companies' occupational needs tend to change so quickly as they grow? How do we build in flexibility to the spaces that companies need? What are they looking for in that regard? Would anyone like to tackle that?
I mean, something that's worked quite well for Oxford Nanopore as we've grown is that we're based in Oxford Science Park. We're near the Harwell cluster as well. But what's happened at Oxford Science Park is we've just been able to take over different buildings as we've grown. So we've now got over 800 employees. We're still relatively close to each other. The headquarters is still the same building, but we've got other buildings. So that for us, the Oxford Science Park has been a great place to grow and build the brand and the culture of the company, together with our manufacturing at the Harwell cluster, which has benefited from the skills ecosystem as you've described.
I think the needs, this is probably too obvious to say, but the needs of those companies differ enormously depending on their scale and where they are in their life cycle. I mean, we're now in a position of having been able to spec from scratch, design, and have built a purpose-built HQ, and we were able to design a lot of flexibility into the lab side of that building to enable us. We use that as a development centre rather than a manufacturing centre, so we'll typically use that facility to design processes, understand new product platforms, and then we export those to our manufacturing facilities in the US or Asia to take them to scale. So for us, I mean, that's worked quite well. I sit on the board of a smaller startup just about to head into Series A, and you know, they've found some good startup space. I think, speaking for the Cambridge cluster, there is startup space to be had. The next space along is a constant topic of conversation. They can't take for granted, even sort of 2 months after moving into that one, that the next space is going to be available. And yet there is the opportunity to build it. There's a site right next to us at the heart of the Cambridge cluster. It's taken, 5 or 6 years to break ground on an incubator building that's designed for companies of that scale. So, you know, the companies are there. In many instances, actually, the sites are there, but there hasn't seemed to be the conviction from developers, perhaps, that if they build it, yeah, they will come because they are around. Yeah, exactly.
And I think if I put on my old hat that I used to wear at the University of Oxford, working on commercialising IP, spinning out new companies from that institution, the first step was relatively straightforward in that, you know, these companies were really nascent. They were employing maybe 3 or 4 people. They were outsourcing a lot of the work. Actually, a basic in vitro biology lab was probably all they needed. But then, as John mentioned, it's that grow-on space. And in fact, it's not necessarily going from that up to 10, 20. It's finding space for 30, 40, 50 people, plus at that stage, maybe more tailored laboratories. You know, do they need the kind of air handling facilities you need for chemistry, for instance? So that's about having the optionality as well. But it's also about real estate developers talking to the companies that are coming through at the early stages and trying to anticipate the nature of the demand that is going to be coming in the next sort of 5 or 10 years. And you know, I think with the critical mass that we have now, that's the demand is there, but tailoring the facilities to meet that is going to be the challenge.
Do you think there are lessons that the UK can learn looking at maybe more established life science real estate markets overseas in terms of how to build out that campus space, build out the parks. If we look to, let's say, some markets in the US, which arguably are more developed on that front, are there ideas we can take to push ahead the real estate footprint within the UK?
I mean, some of it's just ambition, isn't it? When you look at Boston and how the real estate development is exploding out of Cambridge into Seaport area and other parts of the city, and you know, entire blocks going up, devoted entirely to life sciences. And clearly there are some enormous real estate developers out there putting a lot of money into it. So I'm not sure we're ever going to replicate the scale of the US. I'm not even sure we should try to, but I think there's a market need here which isn't fully addressed. I think, and what's been great the last year actually, or maybe even longer, is that there's a number of initiatives now in play which I think are starting to address that, at least, you know, from what I see more of in the Oxfordshire ecosystem. Demand still outstrips supply, but it's starting to catch up.
And I think if we can't replicate the scale, at least we could aspire to replicating the pace. And you know, so we opened, I think, 7 new facilities during the course of the pandemic, none of which were in the UK, not through any lack of enthusiasm for the clusters we have here, but you know, pace and doability. So I think that's one thing it feels like we should be able to keep up with. The other, I think, is that community ambition that you see around, for example, you know, Boston, as you say, Kendall Square as was, which is an ever-changing definition, but as those have grown, they've still looked to try to maintain walkability or easy commutability around a cluster of, you know, retail, living, and life science, as opposed to kind of parking it all out in dedicated campuses. And there may be something there that we can look to continue to explore.
Excellent. Let's open it up to the floor. I'm shocked we've had no Slido questions come through yet, which must mean that you're all ready to put a hand up and have a microphone brought to you. And I'm glad they've changed the lights there because I wouldn't have been able to see anyone. Any questions for the panel? One right there.
Thank you. Yes. Nicole, you talked about manufacturing. My name is Tim Holmes from Endurance Estates. We're a property company bringing forward manufacturing space, potentially for life sciences. Be interested to hear what we think, or the panel think, about the demand for advanced manufacturing space. I noticed Bidwell's report recently showed a very shortage of supply, dropped to something like 115,000 square feet around the Cambridge area. Does the life sciences sector need traditional manufacturing space? Can we help?
I'd have thought the answer to that was yes, but I'll defer to those that are at the coalface to sort of confirm that suspicion.
I mean, in terms of biologics, so new drugs which are antibodies or cell and gene therapies, so not your traditional small molecule chemicals. I mean, globally, there's a huge shortfall in manufacturing infrastructure and capability there, and the same as in the UK, or the same as seen in the UK. So that area in particular, and again, we've developed an amazing nucleus of capability there with the cell and gene therapy catapult, for instance. We've got some world-leading companies in that space, the likes of Autolus, the likes of Immunocore, the likes of Adaptimmune, all of which have now grown to become quite significant companies valued at, well, Nasdaq's horrible at the moment, but they've all been at over $1 billion at some point. So there's an opportunity for us to capitalize on that and to build the scale that's needed, and particularly in cell therapies as we move into the world of allogenic therapies, which could be manufactured at greater scale than the autologous therapies, which are only ever manufactured very, very locally. So yes, there's a big need there, and I think any real estate developers looking to get into that area, will find a very interesting market opportunity.
So, something that I would just comment on from a sort of global perspective is that we as a company are committed to having a manufacturing base in the UK. We have a manufacturing base, therefore, in the UK. Were we not so committed to being a UK-based company, the incentives that we are offered to relocate our manufacturing, not necessarily to the US, which we've mentioned several times, but to countries like Singapore, are incomparable in terms of the incentives we have to create the same manufacturing base and jobs in this country. So I think that is a wake-up call to government to look at what we're doing with R&D tax credits, to look at what we're doing with our manufacturing base, if we want that to be a growth aspect of this economy.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? One right here. If you just hold on, we've got the mic coming down.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rubin from Oxford Brookes University. I want to ask about, kind of a radical question. Do we know really what is life sciences? Because you touched the issue of digital transformation, right? And we know there is a blurry boundary between industries. Does the government know what is exactly life sciences with all the digital transformation, right? So we're thinking about experts in quantum computing, which are key for your development. Does the government know exactly what is life sciences? What do you think?
It's a very good question. Do they know what is life sciences? I mean, actually going to the sort of the opening presentation this morning and the talk about new industries, I mean, do any of us know what life science? I mean, it's evolving and it's emerging and it's changing shape, and it's not just the traditional model that we were all very used to, and it is going to have the technology players driving a lot of the growth, and we are going to be looking at the future of life sciences in a very different way. I mean, there are lots of associations that work really hard to explain to government what life sciences is. I think there's no doubt government recognises the value of data and digitalisation. We had the Goldacre report out just earlier this year, sort of recognising the many challenges of sort of data and getting data from the NHS and making sure that data is going to be useful and valuable going forwards. And there are a number of recommendations around how we do that. So I think there is a recognition of the value of data and digitalisation, the challenges that there are to try and get the most value out of it. But I think there is a commitment to doing that. I mean, I think we all recognise that we sit on 70 plus years of data within the NHS, which is a hugely valuable resource. And if we can just tap into that in a sensible way, that it's going to open so many doors and avenues. So I think there is a recognition of the challenges, whether we've yet got the right incentives in place and sort of solutions to the challenges. I think that's still a moving target.
And I think that convergence of digital and life sciences is an area where we as the UK have a real opportunity. I mean, Abcam by foundation was an e-commerce company. We're probably the first life science e-commerce company. It's only later that we actually moved into life science innovation. And Cambridge was an easy place to build that team at the time of kind of software types and life science types in one place. And while we may not have the $5+ trillion companies of the West Coast, we do have major R&D investment from all of those companies, just down the road and up in Cambridge and in Oxford. And I think there's a real opportunity for us there to be driving that convergence in the UK.
I think government knows far more about life sciences now than it did 2.5 years ago. The civil servants who know what mRNA is now. So, I mean, that's obviously only a part of it, but, I think we've got a good vision in terms of, the roadmap that has been laid out. But I think also we can learn from some of the experiences of the last couple of years with, the Vaccines Task Force being a great example of where government has come together with industry experts to really come up with relevant, workable, efficient solutions. And that dialogue between industry and government is going to be so critical in keeping up with that increased fuzziness of the life sciences sector, because those blurred edges are getting ever more blurred. And we can't be complacent in thinking we can define it perfectly now, because tomorrow it will look like something else. But we do need that continued dialogue. I think that the structures that we have for funding now, with UKRI being an umbrella organisation incorporating Innovate UK and the research councils, is another way that helps kind of pull all that together in a more strategically coherent manner. So I'm cautiously optimistic, to answer your question.
I like a bit of cautious optimism. There we go. That's good. Thank you all so much. We've got a slightly longer break now, so you'll be glad to know you have got time for a cuppa. And we will be back here for the next session at 11:10. But before you go, if you could just show your appreciation for our panel. Thank you.